Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jaw and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We're going to talk about conditional access today and do a deep dive into Entra conditional access. Now, you may think, I already know about conditional access. Yes, it's a very basic concept when it comes to identity. At Microsoft Entra, we've added several things, several different rules and scoping to conditional access over the years. So I think even for the most seasoned veterans of identity, you're going to learn something here today. So let's get into it, Adam, if you want to give our standard disclaimer here.
Yeah, I mean, for a show like this, when we're talking about Microsoft the whole time, I'll just say we both work for Microsoft, but we do the show on our own time outside of work, and we have funded the show ourselves. Microsoft has no editorial control over the show, but of course, we always want to stay in the good graces of our employers who sign our paychecks. And so we just like our listeners to be aware of there is a conflict of interest here. Let's just be honest. We'll call it what it is. But we also like to share what we know and what we're familiar with. And both Andy and I have, I'd say, a fair amount of expertise in Entra over the years. It's certainly an area of high interest of mine and one of the first products I really covered at Microsoft. And Andy, you have kind of picked that mantle up from me since I moved into a salesy role. So yeah, let's get into it.
All right. So conditional access at its core is essentially if you match something, a user, a device, a sign-in condition from this IP, if you match something, then you must do this in order to have access to whatever app or other things. There's actually other things now that are included in that you must get access to. So you must satisfy this condition in order to access something. One of the things that's really nice, and we won't talk too much about device management, but because we have our own MDM, device management and identity are very, very deeply integrated. So we have the ability to use conditional access with devices as well. So again, we're mostly talking about the identity portion of it, but just want to mention, Intune has signals that it can send to conditional access. So we have that. And as well as another thing, we have insider risk now as well on the purview side. And those signals can be brought into conditional access too. So we're going to get into all of that in the deep dive of a policy, but it's not just identity at Microsoft. It is other signals that you're getting. So you must satisfy these conditions. If you match this, then you either get access or you get blocked.
Yeah, it's a really good point. When you're talking about what's the secret sauce of Microsoft, it is that interplay of Intune and Entra together, that device management with identity all in one single control plane. And that is truly differentiated and remains so to this day. In fact, I'll be honest, and I'm not taking a shot at competitors here because we have some really strong competitors both in the UEM and the IAM space. Even where there's partnerships in place, like Okta claims to have this great partnership. Oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on the name. What did AirWatch turn into?
Mobile Iron?
No. Whatever AirWatch is today, I forget who that's even through.
Yeah.
They claim to have this super tight partnership, and they still to this day don't have anything close to this. It is really very, very differentiated for Microsoft. So if you're a Microsoft shopper, you're looking at these solutions, this is an area where if you're not familiar with what's possible here, there just is more capability, more tight integration.
Yeah. And I want to use this example of an amusement park because we're going to come back to it throughout this discussion. So simply put, like if for conditional access, you must provide something in order to get access, right? So in this case, if I'm going to an amusement park, I'm going to provide money in order to get a pass to get into the park. And that's simply like you have your username and password or something like that, and you give it to the identity provider at the beginning, and then you get access. And then we're going to layer on all sorts of other conditions. Like, for example, if you're trying to get in, you must wear clothing. So that's one condition. If you're not wearing clothing or you're carrying weapons or something like that, then you get blocked, right?
Even though you have a pass.
Even if you have a pass, correct. So let's talk through some of the conditional access. We will talk about a little bit in licensing. For licensing, there is Entra P1 and Entra P2, and there are some differences for conditional access when we get into that, right? So when you start with the assignment portion of The conditional access policy is pretty simple. You have targeted users, groups, and roles. And so you can target a specific user, multiple users. You can target a security group, multiple security groups, and then you can also target a specific role within Entra. So global admins, exchange admins. So you can very granular controls on who you want to assign it to. And then when it comes to the target resource, you can target a specific app. So when this user, let's say I'm targeting Adam, when Adam signs into Exchange Online, I could say, I want this conditional access policy just to apply to Exchange Online, or maybe M365 in general, or Salesforce, or other federated applications with Entra, then do something else, right? So you can target applications. You can also target user actions. This is something that's brand new. Well, it's fairly new. So if you haven't dove into conditional access, it's newer. User actions. So you can require a condition to be satisfied if you want to register security information. That means to register a new MFA token, a new FIDO2 key, something like that. You can require something else in order to do that, right? You can require MFA in order to require, or maybe a good one would be you have to be on a certain network in order to register new information, right? A trusted network. Also, to join devices. This is a common one. Maybe you need to MFA in order to join or register a device to Entra. So that's a good one as well. You can also target traffic forwarding profiles from global secure access. That's assuming that you're using Entra private access. And then also target authentication context. Now you're probably thinking, what is authentication context? That's, again, something new. We're going to dive into that towards the end. So stick with us, because that is one of the best uses of session controls and how you can provide more security post authentication. Okay. So we talked through some of the assignments here. When it comes to conditions, right? So you must, if you're coming in and you have this condition. So for example, in the amusement park, right? Like I come in and I'm wearing, or I have a weapon on me. So all of a sudden I'm high risk. Okay. So what do? You're blocking me, right? So you can have user risk, you can have sign-in risk. You're asking, what's the difference between the two? Well, sign-in risk is I'm evaluating that specific sign-in. Every sign-in has a risk value that's associated with it. So Adam's signing in from his home. He signs in at the same time every day. It's on the same machine. That's going to be a low risk or no risk sign-in, right? But all of a sudden, Adam signs in from a Tor browser. That's different. The sign-in automatically gets elevated. Is his user at risk? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe if all the other factors are still the same. User risk is a high probability that the user is at risk. So if the user is high risk, we're getting other signals from M365 that will make us think that the whole user is compromised. Maybe they're signing in to a resource that they normally don't sign into, from a machine that they normally don't sign into, from an IP address that they normally don't sign in from, right? So all these other signals. Maybe MDE is also lighting up with some stuff on their device that is, that they have malware or something else, right? So user risk is like much more significant. If the whole user is at medium risk, that means there's a good chance that something else is happening. Whereas the individual sign-in is just that one sign-in. Okay, whatever. So there's different values that you want to put on those two things, right?
And user risk is also like a running total versus sign-in risk. Again, to Andy's point, is that point in time, this sign-in right now, what is the risk of that? Versus user risk can be offline detections that happen over time. So another extremely high fidelity user risk event is Microsoft will take, if you choose to do password hash synchronization, we'll take your password hashes and compare them against password dumps on the dark web. So a new password dump gets posted to Pastebin. Microsoft will run that through all the same hashing algorithms to get to the same type of hash that's stored in Entra ID and compare it against your user hashes or their password hashes. And if any of them match, it will automatically flag that user as high risk, high user risk. Why? Because it's extremely high fidelity detection. There's a match for a hash that doesn't happen by accident, that's not accidental. It's not a false positive. And it's very serious. Obviously, if someone else knows your user password, that's a very serious event. So it's A, high confidence, and B, high severity. which means absolutely we're just going to flag this user immediately to high risk user. At which case, our guidance is either block the sign in or force a self-service password reset.
Yep. And then, so again, I mentioned insider risk. So insider risk is a new condition that can be given from the insider risk management portal in Purview. So we're sending signals from that. If you're an IRM organization, you have licensing for that, you can use that as a condition here, which is great. Like if that user is at high risk on the insider risk platform, you can take certain things like block their action from happening. So another condition that's brand new here. Device platforms, that's pretty self-explanatory. I can scope it to iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows. Funny enough, Windows Phone is still in there.
I was just going to ask, is Windows Phone still there?
It's still there. Still there.
Someone is so optimistic.
Locations. So you might see a new tab called Network, which, again, I'm actually not familiar with why that's there and locations is still here. It's fairly redundant, but it's essentially if you have trusted networks or IPs. Also, you can do a block action, right? If it's coming from a malicious country or whatever. So you have these trusted networks, trusted IPs that you can scope within conditional access, and then you can take actions based on that. So for example, if I'm coming from this location, my corporate IP, and I want to register a new security information, then it's okay, right? Allow the action, so on and so forth.
I believe networks versus locations, the purpose is networks will be used with global secure access. So you can say, like, if you're coming from Entra Internet Access, then allow access to this.
Yep. That could be a good point there. Good call out. Client apps is another condition. So you can scope if I'm coming from a specific app like Outlook, or if I'm coming from an Edge browser, or if I'm coming from legacy applications. So that's really, like, in this case, what I would say is for most organizations, you can scope a policy, just straight up block legacy client apps, and then, have one that allows from modern applications, right? You must come from a modern application here. You can also filter for devices. So there's the same thing for Intune if you have device groups, or you can do a query for different devices. You can just toss the query right into there. You can apply conditions to only specific devices. And this is fairly unique. Again, like most of the time we're talking about identities. And so we're talking about security groups and users. But in this case, we can actually apply conditional access to a device group or a flag, all corporate, managed devices or something like that, or unmanaged devices, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of granularity when it comes to this conditional access policy.
Here's an example use case for this. Remember, Andy talked about our assignments. We can look for specific roles. If your role type is global administrator, exchange administrator, like highly privileged administrator accounts, then we can do a filter for devices and filter for only your PAWS and SAWs, your privileged access workstations or secure access workstations, and say if it's not in that group, then deny access. You can't sign in as a global administrator without being on a device that matches this group.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you can enforce the usage of PAWS and SAWs to use those highly privileged accounts. As an example, that's one use case you could enable when you have that interplay of device management and identity.
And then the final condition that you can scope stuff to is authentication flows. Again, this is fairly new. It's newer. And there's two things within authentication flows that you can scope conditional access around. One of them is device code flow. So this is used when you're signing into like shared devices or digital signage where there might be a lack of local input into that device. In general, Microsoft recommends blocking device code flow whenever possible, but you might want to scope some conditions specifically around that. So this is like when you don't have a way to type in the username or password or whatever, right? So it's very niche case, but it's something that I think even like maybe Teams phone might fall into something like this. There used to be an issue back in the day with Teams phones. So again, you can scope very specific conditions around it. Must be coming from this network, must be coming from this device. You can put the device IDs in there and so on and so forth. And so you can only allow device code flow from those particular condition.
If you're having trouble wrapping your head around what device code flow is, A use case we're all familiar with is when you're signing into apps on your smart TV or like your Apple TV, where you bring up the ESPN app. It says, scan this QR code, and then, you'll sign in with your username and password on your phone, or we'll give you a code on the screen, YXZ29, and you go to this website and plug it in. Like, that's what that is. You can imagine how that is highly attractive to attackers, because it's a super easy way to phish your users. You say, hey, go here, type in this code. I'm from your help desk. I'm helping you. And now they've been able to sign in as your user and can run amok. So that's why we do recommend you keep that really tightly locked down, only for specific use cases you must.
And then speaking of that QR code, there's another way, a newer way, called authentication transfer. And so in the case that you mentioned very specifically, Adam, you scan the QR code and then you still have to put in your username and password into the browser, right? Whereas authentication transfer is when you're already authenticated into the application or the device, and you transfer that authentication via like a QR code. So there are cases now in that where you're scanning the QR code, and then if you're signed in to say Netflix on your device, it just says, okay, you're good. And that's it. So we're just transferring the authenticated state without having to put in anything else. You're already authenticated, right? YouTube does this a lot. Like, are you signing in from another device? And then you just hit
Tap
the yes.
accept, yeah.
Yep. So that's authentication transfer. And again, these are brand new ways of authenticating that we now have conditions that you can scope around that, or limit it, or however you want to do it. Okay. So we've talked through the assignments. Now let's get into access controls. So this is where you're actually granting access or blocking access. So of course you can just block access. Any blocks will take precedence. So this is something that's also really important to understand about conditional access. They are all evaluated upon sign-in at the same time, right? It's not like an access control list. It's not like exchange mail flow rules where it hits one and then you're out, right? Like, it's all at the same time. And if you have a single block in that conditional access policy, in any of the conditional access policy that you hit, you're automatically blocked. So blocks always take precedent. And then you can go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to say the analogy of lining up the holes in the Swiss cheese kind of thing. You've heard that before in security context. Like, that's conditional access. Is, you may have different holes carved out in different pieces, but you stack them all up. So if you have 10 policies, you've got to stack all the pieces of cheese up, and to allow access, it has to be able to see through to the other side for it to work, to use that analogy. And if there is no pathway through, then that user's effective access is they are blocked. So keep that in mind. To Andy's point, they are all evaluated. You must successfully evaluate all of them. And if different policies import different controls here, as we talk through these access controls, like let's say you hit one and it requires MFA, and you hit another one and it requires your device to be Entra joined, and you hit another one and it requires device to be marked compliant. Well, then the result is you have to do MFA, be Entra joined, and be marked as compliant. You have to satisfy all three to get in. So keep that in mind too.
Yep. You have require MFA, obvious. You have require,
which is just any MFA, by the way. Like that control will just be like, you could do SMS and it's good. You can get a voice call and push one and that counts. So, there's no strength associated with that, but then go to the very next one.
Right. And that's important to remember too. Like, there's the require MFA here, but you also have authentication methods, which is a totally different tab that you can then say, I don't want voice calls to be even considered as an authentication method within my organization as an MFA registration. So you have controls on what you have that can be registered, but then, like Adam said, this require MFA is just any of the MFAs that you've already dictated as acceptable. And then you have authentication strength. And so this is where you can dictate, do I want passwordless? Do I want phish resistant? And again, you can dictate what is phish resistant, pass keys, FIDO2 keys, so on and so forth. So this is a good one to have and to look at, especially for your admins. Microsoft has moved to all employees must use phish resistant MFAs. So we have pass keys that are associated with our authenticator within our devices. We also can get FIDO2 keys like Adam right there. I have one as well. Very similar model.
Yeah, I think the same model. Yep. There we are.
They have to be approved by Microsoft. You can't just register any FIDO2 key to your Entra tenant from Microsoft. That's a great way to step up your authentication here. Now, The other two here require device to be marked compliant and require Entra to be hybrid Entra joint. Those are two, again, very specific access controls that are unique to Microsoft. To be marked as compliant, you must have that compliance policy be evaluated by Intune. It can be an on-premise or hybrid joined machine as long as it's co-managed and that compliance policy has been offloaded to Entra to do that evaluation. We do have also tight integration with SCCM or MECM, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager. We can get signals from MECM into Intune and accept that to like flow back to Intune to say marked as compliant. So a lot of different ways to get that, but Intune has to be involved in some way if you're going to use that compliant marker versus hybrid Entra joint.
Now, and you made a great point that it is independent of the device identity. So however you're doing device identity does not matter. What matters is you made it clear. Intune has a compliance policy and is evaluating it. Now, what's awesome about this is this gives you, I wouldn't say near real time, but compliance policies are evaluated frequently and can automatically lock out devices if they are no longer compliant with policy. Microsoft uses this internally to enforce that we upgrade all of our personally owned devices, our BYOD devices, to current versions of the operating system. And so depending on like how severe the latest like iOS 0 day is or whatever, and Apple just released an emergency security patch for it. Sometimes they've given very short windows, like you have 3 days to install the new iOS or you will get cut off. And I've had it happen to me before where I didn't install it and my email stopped flowing. That's a compliance policy that does that. But the other thing, Andy talked about this too, and this is where you can really start to stitch everything together. Over in the Intune side of the world, one of the compliance policy requirements you can set is the Defender for Endpoint threat level must be at or below a certain threshold. So medium or below, lower or lower. That is how now you can incorporate the risk level as detected by an EDR solution into your identity decision making. No, you cannot get to your email anymore because the EDR told me you're at a medium threat level. Isn't that pretty cool? And that's how all the pieces fit together. That's Defender for Endpoint talking to Intune, which talks to Entra. And because all those pieces are integrated together, you get that result. So don't sleep on device to be marked as compliant. That is an incredibly powerful tool and should really be the North Star for every organization to get to because it gives you that ongoing attestation of the compliance of the device, and you can layer in health components with that as well. It also ties in with mobile threat detection vendors. Even if you're not using MDE on your iPhone, you can tie in and pull in MTD levels from third-party solutions like Zimperium and use that to make decision making as well. So very powerful tool. And again, it's one checkbox in this conditional access policy, but can't emphasize enough like how much is here. And this is really a state I recommend everyone try to get to.
And there is a big difference. You might ask, well, Andy, we are hybrid Entra joint, so we can just use the hybrid Entra joint. There's a big conceptual difference between require hybrid Entra joint and require device to be marked compliant. Let's go back to our amusement park example here, right? So let's say I'm compliant with all the rules. I'm wearing a shirt, I have shoes on, and I get in. Well, if you're just requiring hybrid Entra join devices, yeah, I'm compliant. I have all the things, I get in, and that's it, right? I have free game within there. Once I'm in the amusement park, I take my shirt off, I take my shoes off, all that. I start breaking
this
the
analogy
rules.
Keeps working really well.
Yeah. And so once I'm in, I'm in. That's Entra hybrid join. I'm Entra joined, I'm in, I'm good to go.
Point in time attestation.
And I can break all the rules once I'm in. Whereas
now it's better than nothing, right?
It is better than nothing.
And I've always advocated for this for years now of like, these are steps on a maturity journey. Start with Entra hybrid join, check for that at least is validating it's joined to your organization. It's part of your organization. That's a good first step. I like that. But do not stop there. Do not hang a mission accomplished banner. Keep going and get to device marked as compliant state. But sure, start there. If you can't do anything else, it's at least a good place to start.
Right. Because
when you get to time attestation.
When you get to the device is compliant, that's where you have, say, for example, a security guard that's walking around the park and they see me without my shirt. They're like, hey, you're breaking the rules. you're out of here unless you fix that, right?
So you can put the shirt back on and you can stay.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So you either get kicked out or you can fix it. You have time, you have a grace period where you can get to compliant, right? So that's a better model, right? We can all agree that's a better model for the amusement park, right? So it's a better model in security controls to be at a compliant state rather than just, okay, you're compliant at the gate and go on and do whatever you want to do after that.
On mark compliant versus Entra hybrid join, Entra hybrid join also, of course, only for Windows devices. Device marked as compliant, anything that can be managed by Intune. Vision OS, iPad OS, iOS, Android, Windows, and Mac OS can all use that control. So that is the multi-platform control versus Entra hybrid joins just Windows. Almost forgot.
And you could have the same access controls checked off because at the bottom of these policies, you can have satisfies one or all of these access controls. So you could have required device if you just wanted a device policy for all, like Adam said, good call out on the multi OS there for device to be marked compliant. And then you could have your Windows be a hybrid entry. Okay, so required approved client app, that's pretty straightforward. Let's say you want users to use the Outlook client versus like the default iOS mail app or the Gmail app within Android. So you can require it to be Outlook, and there are specific benefits to that, like the next one, which is require app protection policy, mobile application management, where you can have then protections layered on top of or separate. You can use. We've had this conversation before, MAM versus MDM. You can have both. Right. And so you could require Outlook to be that. And there are benefits to using Outlook. We have our purview stack, our encryption, all of that built in by default. We have our MAM protection, so you can prevent cut and paste or certain, DLP policies to be triggered, all of that. So there are benefits to using an approved client app. And then you can also require MAM, which is another policy, which we're not going to get into too much today, but there's other policies that you can layer on top.
Just validating that is in place.
Correct.
Is really what it does. So it's like you can get to Exchange Online, but only if you're using the Outlook mobile app that has a MAM policy applied to it, a mobile application management policy. Then yes, you can get to Exchange Online, say without managing your whole device. And again, whole rabbit hole there. But let's say you want to do the model where it's like, hey, we don't want to manage somebody's whole device. We just want to put these controls in place on the Outlook app and like containerize the Outlook app. This is how you do that right there, where you still ensure like people just, no one off the street can get to Exchange Online. But if they show up, they've got the Outlook app and has the policy applied and everything's copacetic there, then absolutely, here's your email, go to town. And that's how you can deliver that experience.
And then the final one is required password change. Like Adam said, you can, if you have a user at high risk, then you can require them to do a self-service password change upon login. So
really simple, right? Like if user risk equals high, and if user assignment is all users, then require password change. So that will just effectively make anyone who shows up with a high risk user risk to be able to perform a password change before they're allowed in. And of course, self-service password reset requires other factors, that aren't their password, of course, to validate their identity. So it's a safe way to immediately mitigate that risk at machine speed instead of having to have human interaction, have someone in your security operations center find it, notify the user, reset their password, call the help desk. Like it just happens automatically. It takes that entire workflow out of your hands. Like it's just one example.
So we're going to move on to session controls, and then we're going to wrap up with authentication context. So again, stick around because authentication context is super cool. But session controls is something that is pretty unique to Microsoft, especially in some of these different ones here, because everything we've talked about so far is pre-authentication. So it's before you have even successfully authenticated. And then once you satisfy those conditions, you're allowed in, you get access. But then within that session, so once you get authentication, and once you get that pass to get into the park, right? Now we're going to look at different sessions within there. So a good example is we have multiple different tokens, and I think we have talked about this on the show, but you have your session token, you have your refresh token. With Microsoft, you have primary refresh token, which is just another version of the refresh token specifically for a Windows device. essentially how applications work, right? You get a session token once you authenticate to Entra, to the IDP, and then you exchange that session token for a refresh token, which is short-lived, to get to to use that application. So in essence, in the amusement park example, right? I have my pass, but now I have to show the pass to get a token or another pass to ride the specific ride, right? So I got to show my daily pass, my yearly pass, whatever, my season pass, and get a token to ride that specific ride. And so that's what the refresh token is. And the refresh token is short-lived. It's an hour by default, right? And whereas the session token is 90 days rolling.
I think you have those backwards. Refresh token is 90 days rolling. Session token's 1 hour. Access token.
Well, okay, that's another contention within the security, like, is that sometimes these things have different names, actually.
Yeah.
So, but the long-lived token is 90 days. Let's just say that. The long-lived token is rolling 90 days. Because actually, these do come up differently, how Microsoft names it, how other security professionals talk about it. So there is a long-lived token that is 90 days, and then there is a short-lived token, which is an hour, right? And that's important to remember, because if you revoke the identity and they've already authenticated and exchanged that long-lived token for a short-lived token, they will still have access as long as that short-lived token is valid for that an hour, right?
Yeah, depending on timing, could be up to a full hour.
Could be, right? So these are things that we can enforce conditions around. So a couple of things on this. I'm not going to talk about everything in here. We're just going to highlight a couple of things, right? So conditional access application control, really cool thing. Again, we have our reverse proxy that's built into this. So we could require conditional access app control, which integrates with Defender for Cloud Apps. So it's a reverse proxy. We shift that session to Defender for Cloud Apps, which then you can take additional actions behind post authentication. A good example is, let's say I use Exchange Online from an unmanaged machine and I require conditional access app control. Well, that will then shift to Defender for Cloud Apps to then enforce and say, okay, they're coming into here, they're using Exchange Online, they're coming from an unmanaged machine. What can they do? I will let them view their email, but not download anything. Or maybe I will let them download something, but then I will use Purview and apply this sensitivity label for read only to that document that they're downloading. So you can take additional actions, again, post authentication, but that uses conditional access app control, which integrates with our reverse proxy, our CASB Defender for Cloud Apps, right? Really powerful stuff. We could do a whole show on that, but just know that is there. Sign-in frequency. This is something that almost all IDPs have, right? So this is one way to do that session control. We can limit how often, so there's two options here. We can periodically require the user to sign back in, which means that you have to actually sign back in and get that long-lived token, right? You can't just have that long-lived token anymore. We're going to make sure that you sign in every so often before the 90 days is up, or you can make them sign in every single time. That's probably not the best way for the majority of users on the majority of applications, but there might be something that you would require them to sign in every time and go through that conditional access gateway again to get that long-lived token, right?
Yeah, I will avoid the long soapbox rant and just say the short version is there is a misconception that signing in more frequently equals more secure. That is proven from empirical evidence to be false. However, you may have regulatory environment that requires it. You may have an application that's just so sensitive where you would feel better if you required more frequent sign-in. The one Andy and I always bring up on the show at Microsoft is our benefits portal. Does require more frequent authentication than other sites. I'm always having to sign back into that. Now, again, with the great experience we have, it's Windows Hello for me. So it's just scan my face and boom, I'm in. But it is still a re-authentication versus everything else is just single sign-on. It's seamless. Nothing happens. And so I can imagine anything like where you can change direct deposit settings. Like, yeah, you probably should have to authenticate every time or more frequently for that. Be careful with this. That will be the end of my rant. I will just say, do not turn this on for everything. Do not make your users re-authenticate 50 times a day. It is not more secure. It is proven not to be. All you're doing is training your users to respond more affirmatively to a phishing attempt. So limit this carefully. Less is more in this case. But I get there's some examples where you're going to need to have it, and here it is.
So there is an option to customize continuous access evaluation. Now, this is a really good and important feature. Continuous access evaluation is that next level, and it's based on an open standard. It's that next level of evaluation for that short-lived token, right? So we talked about that being an hour, and it's, you're only exchanging back to that long-lived token once an hour. Whereas continuous access evaluation is now doing near real-time evaluation of, is that long-lived token still there? I'm going to continue to check within the hour to make sure that that long-lived token is still there. And so, again, this is based on an open standard. There are other IDPs out there who have implemented it, and so it might be worth taking a look to see if this is available. We have done it by default for Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint. And we are, of course, looking at expanding that CAE capability to other applications. But right now, built in by default to Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint, which does cover the basis of a lot of our productivity applications. So if that user account is disabled or deleted, then CAE will revoke that short-lived token within the hour because, again, the goal is near real time. It can take up to like 15 minutes, but it's better than an hour, right? So we have that next level evaluation. And then finally, the other thing that I wanted to highlight is token protection. We did do a whole show, I believe, on token protection, but token protection, again, is fairly new. It's in preview. And this is where we're looking at if an attacker steals that, either the short-lived or the long-lived token, and then they replay it or they start minting their own tokens, right? And so what we have now is token binding protection, where that token that's issued is cryptographically bound to the device it is issued on. And so even if that token is stolen, it does no good because the private keys live on the device that that token was issued on, that initial authentication. And so we can check for that. And so again, this is in preview. We have token protection built into our SharePoint and Teams and Exchange. So it's limited, but we can check for that, and it's on those client applications. And if you have this, you can check off require token protection, so we can check to see if that token is cryptographically bound to the device. Of course, we also have ID protections built into Entra, which again, we're not going to talk too much about, but that's post breach, right? If we detect a replay of that token, we can alert you to it. But this is this is like a defense, right? So you can check to see if that token is cryptographically bound, and if it's not, I can block access.
So let me do the amusement park analogy for this one, and this is real. This is how they really do it. They put your picture on your season pass, so someone can't steal your season pass and replay it and say, "I'm Adam Brewer," because their picture doesn't match mine. To keep going with our analogy there, that's why they put your picture on your season pass, so they cannot be replayed or stolen and reused by someone else. That's kind of what this is, effectively.
Exactly. So a lot of cool things that you can do within the session, right? And so kind of moving that session. So this is not really session protection, but it's called authentication context. And so this is, again, fairly new. And you might have seen this, but you're like, how does that work? I don't really understand, or what's the use case for it? So let me give you, again, I'm going to set this up in the amusement park, right? I've gotten in, I got the security guard checking me, right? I'm compliant. I'm exchanging my season pass for the tokens, riding the rides and all that. And now I want to get to a restricted area that's only restricted for certain people, like employees. Well, now I got to show a different badge for that restricted area. How do I get in there? So a good example would be, like, let's say I'm using privileged identity management to escalate to global admin. I've already authenticated to global, or I've already authenticated to Entra, but now I'm trying to get to a privileged role. I want to require other conditions on top of that in order to PIM to that role. Now, if you're familiar with PIM back in the day, and it's still there, you could just require MFA, Azure MFA. And that, again, is just any MFA method, right? You just check the box, require MFA. But again, we can require now conditions, not just MFA, just phish resistant MFA, compliant device from a specific device filter, all of that. All these things that we talked about, we can require that. How do we do that? we scope a conditional, an authentication context. So authentication context in general is a label. It does nothing, right? Just like a purview sensitivity label, you could have just a label that does nothing. And then you can layer protections on top of that. So you go to authentication context within the conditional access tab, and you type in a name and a description for it. And I would make it fairly descriptive. Require fish resistant MFA for PIM or something like that. And then there's your label, right? And so now when you go back to your conditional access policy and you're scoping it for your apps, we talked about it in the beginning, where you're doing a target resource or user action, you can target that authentication context that you just created. So anything labeled with that authentication context, I'm going to apply this conditional access policy to. And you can do the same thing, right? Go through the whole thing that we just talked about, require fish resistant MFA. Let's say we just do that. Anything labeled with this authentication context, we're going to require fish resistant MFA. Cool. Now we have the conditional access policy that is tagged for that label that we created. Now, where do we go? Within Microsoft, we have authentication context available for two specific applications. One is PIM and the other one is SharePoint. So within PIM, you can go and modify the role. So you go to a global administrator, and if you modify the global administrator role, you have a lot of options, right? Require it to time frame, right? You can only be 8 hours max or 2 hours max or whatever it is. But one of those things, new box there, is authentication context. So I can require no additional authentication. I can require Azure MFA, or I can require authentication context. And if I drop down to the authentication context that I created, require fish resistant, it will trigger that conditional access policy that I scoped to that authentication context label. And so now I can require fish resistant MFA to PIM to a specific role. Same thing with the SharePoint site. So it integrates with purview sensitivity labels. So when you create a sensitivity label, you must have SharePoint groups and sites enabled for sensitivity labels, which does require some additional PowerShell. There's a whole walkthrough on how you can do that. But once you have enabled groups and sites to be labeled with purview labels, there's an external sharing / conditional access checkbox when you're creating that purview label, that sensitivity label. You check that box off, and then all of a sudden it walks you through the next screen that says, which conditional access policy do you want to apply? Oh, I want to apply this authentication context that I created. So you tag that label with the authentication context, which then would trigger that CA policy that you created, right? And now anything that I label with that, be it a SharePoint site, all of a sudden, if you're storing secret stuff on this SharePoint site, I must use fish resistant MFA to get to that SharePoint site. So really powerful, right? Tool that you can use to add additional conditional access policies behind PIM and SharePoint, which are two good uses. And of course, this is open for developers to integrate with their applications as well. And we're probably going to add it to additional things in our applications in the future. So good to at least start using it. PIM is a great way. If you're already using PIM, there's no reason why I wouldn't do this for a specific PIM action. Very easy to use. So something that is really good that you should take away and try it out.
Yeah. And in the SharePoint example, one I would think of would be, let's say, pre-release earnings for your finance team before they go out to the public, obviously highly confidential. And this is where we build that defense in depth strategy. Of course, that SharePoint site already should be limited to just the people who need access to it. So just enough access, number one. Number two, any document in there should have a sensitivity label applied. So we're using purview data security to lock down those documents and make sure they can't leak outside. But we should still do this as well, where we're requiring additional authentication context to hit that SharePoint site at all. Maybe normally we don't require fish resistant MFA. Maybe normally we don't require the use of Entra internet access to get to these things. But for this, we want more assurance. So we're going to layer in additional controls, and we're going to tell our finance team, hey, you're dealing with pre-release earnings. Like, this is sensitive stuff. I'm going to give you a YubiKey, and this is something you're going to use because you have access to such sensitive information moving forward. And so when you try to go to get to that, it's going to prompt you to plug that YubiKey in. All right. And yeah, you may get some pushback on that, but these are the kind of things you can do and enable to protect some of the most sensitive documents in your organization. And that's what authentication context lets you do.
Well, hopefully you learned at least something in there, because there's a lot of new capabilities. Authentication context, really cool. I implemented it in my demo lab and was able to demo it successfully. So it works great. So even if you're the most seasoned of identity professionals, hopefully there was something here for you. And if not, you're probably the expert in the area. All right. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. I'll put some show notes for documentation here for you to review. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please let us know. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.